This isn't a retirement home, Mr. Dilly, and that cane disqualifies you before the referee even sees you, Preston Radcliffe said, loud enough for the whole mat to hear, and 40 faces turned to check the joke had landed. Every year, at registration, the old man with the cane asks the desk the same quiet question about a name nobody at the desk has ever been able to place. He asked it again that morning, before Preston ever opened his mouth, and no one had answered him then either. Preston stood at the center of the mat in his pressed GI, clipboard nowhere near him, a laminated card of seating rules tucked into his breast pocket where a man might carry a pack of cigarettes he'd quit 20 years ago and never quite stopped missing. 64 competitors were entered across the weekend. $300 a head in registration fees, a regional sponsorship from an athletic supply chain riding on attendance numbers, and a ledger that closed for filing the moment Sunday's brackets were final. Preston knew all three figures the way other men knew their own birthdays. "I'm not looking to compete," Lloyd Dilly said. His voice carried the flat patience of a man who had explained himself to younger men his whole life and stopped minding it decades ago. "The beginner's demonstration bracket, 10 minutes on a mat with somebody half my size and twice my energy. I filled out the form." "You filled out the form," Preston repeated, and grinned at the row of parents folding chairs along the west wall, the way a man grins when he already has an audience and only needs to remember to use it. "Sir, with respect, this tournament's got television interest this year. We've got sponsors walking the floor tomorrow. I can't have a man with a cane on my mat during a demonstration bracket. Insurance alone would eat me alive, and forgive me, but at your age..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The unfinished sentence did more work in that gymnasium than the finished one would have. If you've ever watched someone underestimated for the last time in their life, you already know the feeling this story is chasing. Lloyd didn't argue. He looked at Preston the way a man looks at weather he's already decided not to travel in, not with anger, just an acknowledgement that the forecast had been given and there was no changing it by discussion. He shifted his weight onto the cane, the brass ferrule catching the fluorescent light overhead, and for a moment the gymnasium held its breath the way rooms do when they sense they've been rude to someone and aren't yet sure by how much. 10 minutes, Lloyd said again, not pleading, just restating a fact that hadn't changed. "That's all I asked for." "Beginner's bracket's full anyway," Preston said, softening now that he'd gotten his laugh, waving a hand toward the registration table as if the matter had resolved itself somewhere out of his control. "Grady can get you a good seat, though. Best view in the house is right there at courtside, and we appreciate you coming out to support the kids." He turned back to his students before Lloyd had fully turned away, already calling out a correction on someone's stance, already moving on to the tournament that actually mattered to him. 64 competitors, $300 a head, a sponsor's clipboard somewhere backstage counting bodies and seats. An old man with a cane was a kindness extended and then forgotten, the way a door is held and then let go. Lloyd made his way toward the registration table without hurrying, each step timed to some internal metronome only he could hear, and behind him the mat resumed its noise like water closing over a dropped stone. The suit he wore had been cut for a narrower decade, a lapel width the tailors didn't make anymore, a break in the trouser that spoke of a man who'd bought it once and intended it to outlast him. It was pressed sharp enough to have come off a hanger that morning, though anyone who looked closely at the cuffs would have seen threadwork redone more than once by a hand that had gotten good at small repairs out of necessity rather than pride. On the left lapel sat a pin so small it registered, to anyone not looking, as costume jewelry, an eagle, globe, and anchor no larger than a shirt button, the metal worn soft at its edges from being handled more than displayed. He did not sit down the way most men his age sit down. He lowered himself in a controlled 4-count, weight shifting hip to knee to seat in a sequence so practiced it looked less like frailty than like a ritual performed for an audience of one. The knee that dictated the sequence had nothing to do with any battlefield, 30-some years of mat work, of taking falls to teach other men how to take them, had worn the joint down long before any war could have. He rose the same way, in reverse, and never once let anyone see him hurry it. The cane itself was hickory, hand-cut, the wood gone the color of strong tea with age and handling. A brass ferrule capped its foot, dented in places from thousands of controlled placements against gymnasium floors and church steps and the porch boards of a house he'd owned for 50 years. Along its shaft, if a person held it to the light and looked with intention rather than glancing, ran a private constellation of file marks, small notches, dozens of them, cut at irregular intervals, some old enough to have darkened into the grain and some recent enough to still show pale. He had never explained them to anyone who asked, and almost no one had ever asked. At the registration table, Grady Tanner processed forms without looking up more than he had to. 1 year into a black belt he'd earned honestly and hadn't yet decided what to do with. He took Lloyd's paperwork, scanned the beginner bracket box already crossed out in Preston's blunt pen, and slid a spectator wristband across the table instead. "You're all set for seating, Mr. Dilly," Grady said, eyes mostly on the next form in the stack. "Same section as always." "Has a boy registered this year?" Lloyd asked, the way he asked every year. "Under no name in particular? Somebody who came through without much fuss. You'd remember if he had." Grady looked up then, because the question made no sense on its face, and yet something in the asking of it suggested it wasn't nonsense at all, that somewhere behind the old man's eyes a real name existed, one he'd simply decided, for reasons of his own, never to speak aloud. "No, sir," Grady said carefully. "Nobody like that this year, or I don't think so." "You wouldn't," Lloyd said, not unkindly, and took his wristband and found his seat at courtside with the same 4-count patience he did everything else, while Grady watched him go and filed the moment away without knowing yet that he'd need it. Preston Radcliffe had not always been a man who won arguments by citing a laminated card. 20 minutes before Lloyd Dilly ever reached the registration table, Preston had been kneeling on the mat's edge with a 15-year-old named Delia Ammons gripping her lapel wrong for the 3rd time in a row, and the difference between the version of Preston correcting her and the version who would later wave off an old man with a cane was the difference between a man doing the one thing he was unquestionably good at and a man performing certainty for a room. "Your right hand's too high," Preston told her, low, no audience voice at all now, just craft. "You grip that high, he pulls you forward, and you've done his work for him. Drop it 2 inches. Feel where his sleeve actually bends when he moves his weight, not where you think it should be." Delia dropped her grip. Preston mirrored her stance, took her wrist, walked her through the correction in slow motion twice, then at speed once, his hands never rougher than the lesson required. When she executed the throw clean on the 3rd attempt, dropping her practice partner in a controlled arc that ended in a mat slap and not an apology, Preston didn't cheer. He nodded once, the nod of a man confirming what he'd already known was possible, and said, "That's the one you use tomorrow, not the flashy one. That one." It was the kind of teaching that had made him a 2-time regional champion in his own competitive years and had built Radcliffe Judo Academy into the kind of program that drew sponsors and television interest and 64 entries in a single weekend. He had earned the certainty. That was the trouble with it. A man who has never been wrong about a grip starts to assume he cannot be wrong about anything standing on his mat. By the time he'd finished with Delia, the gymnasium had refilled around him. Parents finding their folding chairs, competitors stretching in loose clusters, and Lloyd Dilly had settled into his courtside seat with the stillness of a man who intended to stay exactly where he'd been put. Preston caught sight of him again during a lull between matches, and perhaps because the joke had gone over so well the first time, decided to spend it twice. "Mr. Dilly's staying for the whole tournament," Preston announced to the mat generally, pitching his voice for the room the way he'd learned to from years of running clinics. "Man's got more patience than the rest of us. Just don't let him near the mat unsupervised. Cane like that, he could take a knee out just standing up too fast." A ripple of laughter went through the parents' section, the easy kind that costs the laugher nothing and the target something he doesn't show. Lloyd didn't react beyond a slow blink, the kind a man gives sunlight rather than an insult. 20 minutes later, walking the floor between matches, Preston passed close enough to Lloyd's chair to ask, with the particular brand of politeness that manages to condescend while appearing solicitous, whether he needed anything brought to him: water, a cushion, help finding the restroom. "I know these bleachers aren't built for comfort," Preston said, and smiled at a passing referee as if the two of them shared the joke. "I've sat in worse," Lloyd said. "I'll manage." The third time came an hour on, when a boy of perhaps 10 wandered near Lloyd's seat between matches, curious about the cane the way children are curious about anything that looks like it has a story attached. And Preston, seeing this from across the mat, called out, loud enough to draw eyes, "Careful there, champ. That's not a toy. That's Mr. Dilly's walker. Give the man his space." The boy retreated, embarrassed without understanding why, and Lloyd watched him go with something unreadable crossing his face before it settled back into stillness. A few of the parents exchanged looks that weren't quite disapproval, and weren't quite comfort either. The look of people who sense a small cruelty passing through a room and decide, collectively, that it isn't their business to name it. Lloyd said nothing to any of it. He turned his attention back to the mat, where the first real matches of the day were beginning, and settled in to watch with the patience of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that some corrections aren't worth making in the moment they're needed. He watched the first match the way a man reads a ledger he already knows the sum of. A boy in blue scored what looked, to every parent in the bleachers, like a clean throw for full points, and the crowd began its rise into applause before the referee's hand had even finished its arc. Lloyd's lips moved, almost nothing, a shape more than a sound, and the referee called the score down to a lesser value a half-second later, citing incomplete control on the landing. The applause died mid-breath and rebuilt itself smaller. Grady, 2 seats down, doing double duty as scorekeeper's runner, caught the old man's mouth moving that first time and told himself it was nothing. A tic, maybe, the kind old men get. By the second match, he wasn't so sure. A girl in white attempted a foot sweep against a taller opponent, missed her angle by what looked to Grady like nothing at all, and Lloyd's mouth shaped 3 words before the referee raised a hand and called a procedural violation on the girl's positioning, a rule Grady himself had to look up later to confirm existed. Lloyd hadn't looked at a rule book. He hadn't consulted anyone. He'd simply known, the way a man knows the layout of a house he built with his own hands, which walls were load-bearing and which were only there for show. Grady found himself watching Lloyd more than he watched the mat. There was nothing showy in it. No lean forward, no muttering for effect, no attempt to be noticed doing what he was doing. Lloyd sat with his cane planted between his feet, both hands folded over its brass-capped head, back straight in a way that owed nothing to the folding chair's design, and called each score down to its precise fraction before the men whose entire job was calling scores had finished raising their hands. Between matches, in the lull while officials conferred over a disputed point, Grady set down his scorekeeper's clipboard and crossed to Lloyd's row, because curiosity had finally outweighed the awkwardness of Preston's jokes still hanging faintly in the gym's air. "You called that last one before the ref did," Grady said. Not an accusation. A genuine question, the kind a young man asks when he's decided a thing is more interesting than embarrassing. Lloyd considered him for a moment, the way a man considers whether a question deserves the full answer or only the true one. "I've watched a great many matches," he said. "You start to see the shape of a rule before you hear it named. It's no different than knowing a storm's coming from the color of the light." "That's not really an answer," Grady said, and something in his own boldness surprised him. "No," Lloyd agreed, "it isn't." He didn't elaborate, and Grady, sensing correctly that further pressing would earn him nothing but the same patient silence, let it go, though he carried the exchange back to the scorer's table with him, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he isn't sure is real currency or a token from some game he's never played. He didn't get more than that from Lloyd that morning, because the gymnasium doors opened just then, and a woman in an official's blazer entered with the unhurried authority of someone who had walked into 100 rooms exactly like this one and never once needed to raise her voice to be heard in them. She carried a printed run sheet under one arm and moved toward the scoring table with the tournament's business plainly on her mind, sanctioning paperwork, seeding disputes, the usual administrative weather of a regional event. And it was only when she was halfway across the floor that her eyes found the courtside section and stopped moving entirely. Sloane Quillen had refereed and sanctioned regional tournaments for 11 years since her own retirement from 31 years of Marine Corps service. The last stretch of it spent running training pipelines that half the instructors in this gymnasium had never heard of and the other half had learned from without knowing whose lineage they were standing in. She had walked into Radcliffe Judo Academy that morning, expecting seating disputes and sponsor logistics. She had not expected to see, seated in a folding chair at courtside in a suit 30 years out of fashion, a man she had last stood in front of at attention on a training mat on the other side of the Pacific, decades before either of them had gray in their hair. She stopped mid-sentence to the scoring table, the printed run sheet still under her arm, one hand raised halfway through a gesture she never finished. Preston, standing nearby reviewing a bracket dispute with another official, noticed her stall and followed her sightline, confused, expecting a familiar face among the parents, or perhaps a fellow official he hadn't clocked yet. Sloane crossed the gymnasium floor without acknowledging anyone in her path, her stride longer and more deliberate with every step, until she stood in front of the folding chair where an old man sat with both hands folded over the brass-capped head of a hickory cane. She looked down at him for a long moment, long enough that the gymnasium's ordinary noise, mat slaps, a whistle, a parent's cough, seemed to recede without actually stopping. "Anvil," she said. One word. Not a greeting, not a question. A designation spoken the way a man might read a name off a headstone he hadn't expected to find in this particular cemetery, on this particular day. The gymnasium went quiet in stages, the way a struck bell goes quiet. Loud, then less loud, then a held vibration that isn't sound anymore, but still isn't silence either. Preston's mouth had opened to say something to the other official beside him and simply stopped there, unfinished, his laminated card still half drawn from his breast pocket, where he'd been about to cite a seeding rule to end the bracket dispute. Grady, at the scorer's table, felt the whole room tilt slightly on some axis he didn't have a name for yet. Lloyd Dilly looked up at Sloane Quillen with no particular surprise on his face, only the settled patience of a man who has been waiting a long time for a question he already knows the shape of, and said nothing at all. Sloane didn't explain herself immediately, and the room's silence stretched to accommodate that. She set the printed run sheet down on the empty seat beside Lloyd, deliberately, the way a person sets down something they no longer trust their hand to hold steady while they're doing something else with their attention. She looked around the gymnasium once, at Preston, frozen with his card half out, at the parents in their folding chairs, uncertain whether to keep watching or look away, at Grady, who had risen halfway out of his own chair without deciding to, and then she looked back down at Lloyd and pulled a second folding chair close enough to sit facing him, knee to knee, the way subordinates do not sit with men they merely respect. 35 years, she said, quieter now, for him rather than the room, though the room heard it anyway because the room had gone silent enough to hear anything. I looked for you for the better part of 10 of them. When I still had the clearance to look, you went and got old on me somewhere I couldn't follow. I got old everywhere at the same rate, Lloyd said. You'll get there too, given time and a little cooperation from the world. A few of the parents laughed, quick and startled, the sound of people relieved to have permission to make any sound at all. Preston did not laugh. He had lowered the laminated card without appearing to notice his own hand doing it, and he stood very still, watching a woman with a Federation title kneel her attention toward a man he had, less than 2 hours earlier, told could not set foot on his mat. Sloane addressed the gymnasium then, though her eyes stayed mostly on Lloyd, her voice carrying the particular restraint of a woman choosing every word for its accuracy rather than its effect. This man ran hand-to-hand instruction for every close combat pipeline that came through the Pacific Training Commands for 24 years, she said. I came through that pipeline as a sergeant with more confidence than sense, and he is the reason I left it with the second half fixed. Half the technical judo curriculum this federation still teaches came out of a rule set he helped write before most of you were born, back when nobody thought to write his name on it because he asked them not to. Preston found his voice at last, though it came out smaller than the one he'd used to joke about walkers an hour before. Anvil, he repeated, testing the word like a man testing ice. That an old call sign, or a training designation, Sloane said. Given, not chosen. He wouldn't have told you that himself if you asked him for the next 35 years. She turned back to Lloyd. Which is exactly what you were counting on, wasn't it? Sit in the cheap seats, ask your question at the desk, go home before anybody looks twice. Lloyd didn't answer that either, but something in his stillness this time carried the shape of an admission, the way a held breath admits, eventually, that it was being held for a reason. Sloane's restrained accounting did not stop at what Lloyd had been. It moved, without her quite intending it to, into what he had built. The rule set, the scoring definition still governing every bracket in this gymnasium, and that turn was what opened the door Preston least wanted opened, though he did not yet know it. The technical throw scoring in the current Federation manual, Sloane said, half to Lloyd and half to the room now, still runs off definitions from an original 1980s draft. I know because I sat in rooms where men argued over commas in it. There was a seating technicality in that draft, a weight category carryover rule that got written wrong once and quietly fixed once. I'd have to check the current manual to be sure it's still fixed. Preston's hand went to his breast pocket, an old reflex, and touched the laminated card there before he seemed to remember what card it was. "It's fixed," he said too quickly. That's just the rule. That's not personal, that's just the card. I run every seating dispute off that card. Sergeant Major, I didn't write it, I just follow it. Nobody's accusing you of writing it, Sloane said, mild as weather, though something in the mildness didn't sit easy on Preston at all. Grady, still standing at the scorer's table with his clipboard forgotten in one hand, made the mistake that would cost them a full day, though he made it in good faith and for the right reasons. "I can pull the archive," he offered, eager to be useful, to be the one who fixed this rather than merely watched it happen. "We keep old bracket sheets in the back office, going back, I don't know, a while. I'll find whatever year you need." He found a year. It was, as it turned out, the wrong one, an archive box labeled with a date 2 seasons off from the ruling in question, its bracket sheets showing nothing but ordinary results, no technicality, no carryover dispute, nothing that supported Sloane's memory of a rule ever having been wrong at all. Grady brought it out triumphant, and it landed like a stone in still water. Preston seized on it immediately, some of his composure visibly returning. "See, there's nothing here," Preston said, tapping the sheet Grady had produced, his voice finding its footing again. "I appreciate what you're, Sergeant Major, I do, but I've got 64 competitors and a ledger closing Sunday night, and I can't go rewriting seating rules on the strength of somebody's memory from before I was born. No offense meant, sir." This last directed at Lloyd, who received it with the same slow blink he'd given every insult that day. "The rule's fine," Preston said again, and this time it sounded like he was convincing himself as much as anyone else. "It's procedure. It's been procedure as long as I've run this academy." Sloane didn't argue with him. She simply looked at the wrong year archive box, then at Grady, whose face had already begun to fall as he realized his help had, for the moment, made the case look weaker rather than stronger, and said, "Try the box behind it." The tournament clock kept running regardless of any of them. Sunday's ledger would close whether the right year was found today, tomorrow, or not at all, and every hour spent chasing the wrong box was an hour the correction did not have to spend. Grady found the right box the following morning, before the gymnasium had properly filled for Sunday's matches, and he found it the way most true things are found, not through cleverness, but through the plain discipline of going back and doing the job right the second time. The bracket sheets inside were yellowed at the corners, typed on a machine that had gone out of production before Grady was born, and stapled to the back of the topmost sheet was a single carbon copy memo, its purple ink faded but legible, bearing a ruling on a weight category carryover dispute and a signature at the bottom that read only reviewed and corrected per findings, with no name attached at all. "This is it," Grady said, and something in his voice had changed from the day before, less eager to be useful, more simply certain. He laid the memo in front of Sloane and Preston both. "Somebody fixed this exact rule, decades ago. And whatever's in the current manual, Preston's card, it's not this. It's the old version, the broken one." Sloane read the memo twice, slowly, and when she looked up, her face had the particular stillness of a person confirming something they already suspected but had hoped, faintly, might turn out otherwise. "This is the correction I remember sitting in the room for," she said. "I was wrong about one thing. I thought it stayed fixed." She turned to Lloyd. "You wrote this." "I typed it," Lloyd said. "Somebody else decided whose name went at the bottom. I didn't mind. I minded some years later, when I heard it had been quietly walked back after I'd stopped attending Federation meetings. I made some calls. Nobody with authority to reopen it would return them. I let it go. I had a shop to run and a wife who needed me home more than the sport needed my opinion. The current Federation manual, when Sloan pulled its relevant page up on the scoring table's laptop, carried the carryover rule in its original broken form. The very version Lloyd's memo had corrected decades before, resurrected at some point after his departure from the Federation's rooms and left standing ever since as unquestioned procedure. Under that broken rule, a weight category carryover had quietly demoted a specific tier of competitors for 6 consecutive seasons. Junior athletes shuffled down brackets they should never have left, their standings recorded and filed and forgotten by everyone except the families who'd lost titles to a clerical fiction nobody thought to question, because the card said it was procedure, and the card, Preston had always assumed, did not lie. 6 seasons, Sloan said quietly, and the number sat in the room the way numbers do when they represent children rather than statistics. Preston had gone very pale over the course of this reading, the laminated card still in his breast pocket, its authority gone thin and papery in his own estimation now that he understood what it had actually been enforcing. "I've cited this rule probably 40 times, he said, mostly to himself. I told parents it was fair. I told kids it was fair. He looked at Lloyd for the first time without any trace of the morning's jokes in his face. Why would somebody bring it back? On purpose? It was Sloan, not Lloyd, who answered that, because she had spent 11 years sitting on sanctioning committees and had learned to recognize the shape of an old favor when she saw its outline. Corbin Devereaux has run this region's sanctioning office for going on 16 years, she said. Before that, he had a sponsorship relationship with a rival junior program 2 counties over, a carryover rule that keeps a certain weight tier from advancing out of a lower bracket, keeps that program's roster looking stronger than it would otherwise. I can't prove intent from a memo. I can prove the rule went from corrected to broken again sometime during his tenure, and I can prove nobody's looked at it since. Preston sat down on the edge of the scoring table, an unstudied motion, nothing like his usual clinic posture, and for a moment he looked less like a 2-time regional champion and more like a young man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. The ledger closes tonight, he said. Then we've got until tonight, Sloan said. She turned back to Lloyd, and something in her posture shifted from official to something older and more personal, a debt she seemed to have been carrying the shape of for longer than the morning had lasted. You put my name forward for the Pacific training billet, she said. 35 years ago. I was a sergeant, nobody above the rank of captain had any reason to remember, and my file came back approved with your recommendation attached to it, and I never once asked you why you'd bothered, because by the time I understood what that recommendation had done for the rest of my career, you'd already stopped taking calls from anyone at the pipeline. You were good, Lloyd said. It wasn't complicated. It was the only thing that made the next 30 years possible, Sloan said, and you never mentioned it to me once in all the years since, not even today, not even now. She said this without accusation, the way a person states a fact they've only recently finished being surprised by. I owe you a filing today that I would have made anyway, on the evidence alone. I want you to know I'd have made it even without owing you anything, but I do owe you, and I don't intend to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise. Lloyd looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that Grady, watching from behind the scoring table, would later describe to himself as the closest thing to surprise he'd seen the old man show all weekend, not at the debt itself, but at hearing it spoken aloud after 35 years of silence on the matter. Corbin Devereaux's office would need to be notified formally. The sponsorship conflict would need documenting, and the broken rule would need overturning through the same Federation channels that had let it quietly resurface in the first place. 3 separate procedural fires that would ordinarily have taken weeks to put out properly. Sloan had at most until the ledger closed that evening. She looked at her watch, then at Preston, then at the wrongly filed carryover rule glowing on the laptop screen between them, and said, "We're going to need this in writing. From him." She nodded toward Lloyd, under the name that made the original correction stick the first time. The formal statement sat on the scoring table by mid-afternoon, a single typed page requesting that Lloyd Dilly affirm, over his own signature and his old training designation, that he had authored the original 1980s correction and could attest to its language against the current broken rule. Sloane had drafted it herself, careful and spare, and slid it across to him with the particular gentleness of someone asking for something they already suspected would cost more than it appeared to. "You could sign it as a private citizen," she said. "Just Lloyd Dilly. It'd carry less weight with the Federation board, but it's your right to keep the rest of it out of this." Lloyd looked at the page for a long moment without picking up the pen beside it. 35 years he had kept that designation out of rooms exactly like this one. Out of Federation meetings, out of interviews, out of the mouths of men who might have made something of it he never wanted made. He had built a life on the other side of that silence. A dojo of his own, eventually. A marriage of 41 years. A Tuesday night beginner's class he still sometimes taught with his hands more than his voice. The words Sloane had spoken aloud that morning had never once, in all that time, been something he chose to say about himself. 6 seasons of children, he said finally, got moved down brackets they earned their way out of. That's not something I get to be precious about. He picked up the pen. "Where do you need the designation?" He signed it in a hand steadier than his rising from a chair, the old training designation appearing on federal paper for the first time in 35 years, and set the pen down with no more ceremony than a man setting down a tool he'd finished using. Preston watched him do it, and something in the watching seemed to complete an arithmetic he'd been running since the wrong year archive box the day before. He picked up his own laminated card from his breast pocket, the one he'd cited perhaps 40 times across 6 seasons as unimpeachable procedure, and did not put it back. He walked it to the trash can near the scoring table and dropped it in, not as theater, not for the room's benefit. Most of the room wasn't even watching him do it, but the way a man discards a tool he's discovered was misweighted the whole time he trusted it. "I'm pulling every ruling I've made off that card for the last 2 seasons, he told Sloane, quiet enough that it wasn't for an audience. "Everyone. I want to know how many kids I moved without knowing why." It was, Grady thought, watching from the scorer's table, the first true thing he'd heard Preston say all weekend that wasn't already halfway to being a joke. Near closing that evening, with the Federation's ledger deadline still hours off and the paperwork moving through channels Sloane had spent the afternoon forcing open, Lloyd sat alone for a while at the registration table while Grady ran statements back and forth to the scoring office. He drew a small tally book from his breast pocket, worn soft at its corners, and beside it laid a folded receipt of the day's late registration fees. A handful of walk-ins who'd paid cash for spectator seats. He counted the cash last, the way he always did, folded each check twice before setting it beneath the bills, and eased the drawer shut with the flat of his palm rather than pushing it home. He closes the register the way she taught him. Cash last, checks folded twice, the drawer eased shut rather than pushed. Eleanor had run a front desk very much like this one for the better part of 2 decades, and 14 years after her passing, the sequence remained exactly hers, performed now in a gymnasium 3 states from the shop where she'd first taught it to him, because some corrections, once made properly, are worth keeping forever after. The corrected junior standings were filed with the Regional Federation 11 weeks later, following a formal review that upheld every finding in Sloane Quillen's report and referred Corbin Devereaux's sponsorship conflict to the Federation's Ethics Committee for a hearing that would take the better part of a year to resolve properly. 41 competitors across 6 seasons had their brackets retroactively corrected. 19 were awarded titles they should have carried years earlier, filed now under an asterisk explaining the delay in language plain enough that any parent could understand it without needing to know who Lloyd Dilly was at all. Radcliffe Judo Academy kept its sanctioning status. Preston kept his position, though he ran it differently now. Every seating dispute cross-checked against 2 independent officials rather than a single laminated card, a policy he instituted himself and never once described as a correction for his own past error, only as good practice going forward. He still coached grip corrections inches from real losses, still built champions out of 15-year-olds with 2 high hands, and the 2-time regional champion in him had lost nothing in the exchange except a certainty he had never needed as badly as he'd believed. Grady Tanner ran the registration desk full-time by spring, having been promoted less for his rank on the mat than for the plain fact that Preston trusted him with things that mattered now. Every year at registration, he asked the desk's own quiet question on Lloyd's behalf. phrased almost exactly as Lloyd had always phrased it to every new family that came through. Whether a boy under no name in particular had been entered this season, a question he still could not answer for himself and had stopped expecting to, though he asked it anyway, the way a man tends a fence line whose original purpose he's forgotten, but whose upkeep he's decided matters regardless. Lloyd had never explained the question to him, not fully, and Grady had come to understand that some things a man carries are not owed an explanation to anyone, including the one who inherits the carrying of them. Sloane Quillen visited the academy twice more that year, once in an official kapiki,